activation. Yeah, it's one of my favorite projects that we do. We do all kinds of projects. I mean, there's pricing projects that we do, there's go-to-market strategy and, acquisition troubleshooting. And sometimes we get into like competitive intelligence and sometimes we get into research. I mean, we always get into research in some kind of way, but activation, I think, is probably my favorite type of project to do. And I think it's because it's the middle child, so to speak. I think it's the child that doesn't get as much attention, but it's also between two siblings. And because of that, it impacts both of them. So your activation experiences impact both acquisition. It also impacts your ability to retain. It impacts monetization. And it's not quite the center of the universe, but it's definitely, it is the lever that can make your retention incredible. It's also the lever that makes it trash if you don't pay attention to it. And at the same time, it can make your marketing extremely efficient, your acquisition, at least your customer acquisition, or it can make it absolutely trash as well. Because if it's too hard to get value from the product, if it's too hard to use the product, if it's not very friendly, and it might still be easy to use and not be the most user-friendly. Like, that's very possible to have that be true. I think that's why I like it so much, because of how much it tackles, how much it can help when you do a good job with it. And then at the same exact time, it's kind of this like it's very overlooked. It's not really, I think the highest performing companies do usually care a lot about it. When it comes to product-led growth and PLG companies in general, activation is crucial. If you don't have a product if your product is not self-service, or if you don't have a self-service motion, or if you have a self-service motion, but you don't care about it because you're primarily sales-led, activation is going to feel like, it's a box to check and you might not even really check it that hard. Like, you might not care about it that much. But if you're PLG and most of your revenue comes from PLG, most of it's product-led growth, even if it's sales-assisted product-led growth, activation is crucial. And it still kind of blows my mind that so many founders, especially bootstrap founders, don't really spend a whole lot of time on it. And I think I know why, especially on the bootstrap side. I think maybe a little less so on the VC funded side, but I think it depends. I think even VC funded companies struggle sometimes too. And a lot of times it's just because they don't have like the internal expertise or in-house expertise. They also are not familiar with the process. This is also true, I think, for bootstrappers as well. But a lot of it, I think, comes down to I think a lot of founders and teams don't realize or understand that there is a process to improve your activation. And it's actually very highly repeatable. And the more that you can build that muscle, the better at it you're going to get. And you don't have to guess. And I think that's the thing that kind of hurts my heart a little bit, is I think a lot of people think that, great activation is guessing. And it's not. It's definitely not. It's actually very straightforward, the process for improving activation rates.
I'm excited to dive into that. I'm guessing you're going to talk about the process.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Can you first define activation? So if a company is offering a free trial, is activation after that?
So the ultimate idea behind activation is the journey through which a new user understands or experiences the value of the product. And in some theories, or at least like mindsets, some people also believe that activation is also the process of actually becoming a customer. So actually paying for it in some kind of way, whether that's talking to the salesperson or whether that's entering in your credit card or whatever. I like to think of it as it's the process that a user goes through to experience value from the product. And what makes activation powerful is that happens as fast as humanly possible, because we are a very impatient species on this planet, and also very forgetful as well. You don't have a person's attention for very long in this day and age. And also that there's ultimately a product market fit between the user and the value that you're providing. So this is kind of where we get into like activation and acquisition speak to each other a lot, because the right person ideally activates as effectively and efficiently as possible. The wrong ICP, or ideal customer profile, certainly could activate as well in your product. And in theory, like, you want them to, like, if you make it good for one, like, you'd make it good for everyone, right? But this is kind of where, like, you want to make sure that activation is good enough that you can identify like who's going to be a great user for you versus maybe someone who's not quite the fit, but they understand the value, and that maybe they can refer others. So you want to have a great activation experience for almost anyone who signs up for your product, but especially the ones who are within your ICP. And ideally, that is as fast as possible. Because we're in the world of SaaS, activation, traditionally speaking, is through the product. So it is the process of signing up for the product, of actually like using the product, And again, getting set up enough that they experience the value and that they understand like this is what it's going to provide. Some people would say that this includes onboarding, and some actually would argue that activation also includes the marketing site, because the expectation that you set for people starts on the marketing site. So from the moment they hit the website to the second that they're signing up to all the way like into actually using the product. So that's where activation and acquisition blur a little bit, because the acquisition experience that you provide people sets them up for how they're going to activate later. And activation also speaks to retention, because the better that you are able to activate the best paying customers or best paying users, etc., the better that you'll be able to retain them. So if you have an incredible activation experience, and also like you do a pretty good job of just communicating value over time, aka customer lifecycle marketing, the better you're going to be able to retain those customers. Again, assuming, of course, that they're the right fit, and assuming, of course, that you've got good product market fit with that ICP. So all of this falls apart if you don't have good product market fit. It doesn't matter how amazing your big activation experience is. If this is not the right product for the right person, it doesn't actually matter. We've got to go back to the drawing board and we got to solve a different problem. But all that to say, so that's kind of where activation sits. It's a very long explanation, but hopefully that helps.
Yes. No, that's helpful. Yeah. So where do you want to go next?
Yeah. So that's where activation sits. I'd like to chat through maybe a little bit of what doesn't work in activation, or where the emphasis is when it comes to activation. So, for example, a lot of people think activation is just onboarding emails. It's just the emails that you send. And that's not at all true. There are some people who think activation is just the sign-up flow. That is also not true at all. Some people think that activation is just the process of becoming a customer, like, going to the payment screen and becoming a customer. That's not true either. Activation is all of this and more. And it's every product screen. It's every product in-app touch point, and also outside of the app. So activation can actually include the ads that you run when someone becomes a trialist or whatever. I'm speaking more from the PLG experience. If you are sales-led, activation is the onboarding call that you have. It even starts in some cases at the demo that you provide. You set the expectation for activation from every single touch point that you have with a customer, even if they never actually touch the product. And by the time that you get to onboarding or implementation or delivery, some people call it delivery, all of that's activation. And the goal is some companies have long activation cycles. Sometimes it's months, especially if you have a really highly complex, huge product. If you're working with enterprise companies, for example, and you have a very large enterprise platform, your activation could last like 3 to 6 months. The goal, however, is that you do all of that upfront investment to hopefully keep them for 2, 5, 10 years. Like that's why you go through that entire process. On the PLG side or sales assisted side, it's a little different, but it's because traditionally speaking, like the user probably already has access to the product. They don't necessarily have to have a demo to buy it. And the activation experience is primarily through product. So when you are sales led and you're selling to enterprise or very large organizations, or you have a very large product, your activation experience in-app should still be incredible. That's not an excuse to have a trash product. It should still feel amazing. But chances are people's ability to actually get onboarded and be effective with the product, it might require the white glove onboarding or hand holding. And that experience should also be amazing. The training process should be amazing. I mean, these are all the different touch points. But again, it's different because it's value delivered through humans rather than purely through product. When it's PLG, though, that's where value is delivered almost exclusively through product and maybe a little bit of human touch point. So, there's customer support, there's success, potentially sales if you have like sales assist. But I would say 60 to 80% of it's going to be through product. And this, I think, is where there's a lot of misconceptions about how to deliver incredible activation experiences through product. And there's also just like unknowns, maybe not confusion, but people just don't know. So for example, my biggest complaint, my biggest gripe, my biggest kvetch about activation is when founders, CEOs, and their teams, they kind of chalk it up to, pop-ups and tooltips and walkthroughs, like visual walkthroughs, like where you kind of click like, oh, step 1, look at this, step 2, blah, blah, blah. Then there's like onboarding checklists are really popular. And my biggest pet peeve is when a product has that configured, but they don't have great activation rates. Mm-hmm. And it's because the team has a core fundamental belief that what they're doing is either enough or it's the right thing. And I think, like, don't get me wrong, there are lots of really cool tools out there to help us do and provide great onboarding activation experiences. But my experience has been that, especially now in the year of our Lord and Savior 2026 and just modern SaaS, most people don't see pop-ups anymore. There's pop-up blindness now. We do a lot of UX interviews. We'll definitely talk about process here in a second, but we do a lot of UX interviews and most people don't even acknowledge pop-ups anymore. So if you have pop-ups or overlays or, like overlaid walkthroughs, unless you're, I mean, I've seen some experiences that are really cool and they look amazing. And I'm not going to say that this doesn't work for everyone. I think walkthroughs and things like this do work for some products. But I will say that they are so overused that two things happen. The first is users kind of ignore them. And the second is that it kind of creates this dynamic where we don't create great product experiences anymore. We kind of just say a walkthrough or a pop-up or a tooltip is going to take care of me, instead of just creating good design, instead of like just designing the product well and then actually battle testing it, like actually getting feedback on if that design actually worked. It's like very frustrating. But at the same time, where there's frustration, there's opportunity. So while I'll say like, man, that's like, I really wish people would stop doing this, I also understand why we do it. It's easy, it's fast. But I would say, we have to be careful about relying too much on them and instead not relying, which in my opinion, we should be relying on, not depending on product and depending on, okay, but is it clear on every screen what someone should be doing? And that is the ultimate goal, I think, of great activation. I remembered a few stats, actually, just off the top of my head, because I give a lot of talks and these come to mind. They kind of do low-key live rent-free in my head. So for bootstrappers, the average, I'm going to say free trial to paid conversion rate, because activation rates are dependent on a few things. So first, an activation rate could literally be like, what is a conversion rate from, sign up to experiencing like your value moment or whatever. And that fluctuates a lot depending on how you define it. So I'm not going to say activation rate, but the average free trial to paid conversion rate for a bootstrapped founder, if they are less than 1 million in ARR, it's like 15%. For bootstrappers 1 to 5 million in ARR, I actually think the number is similar. It's not much more. It's like 19%. Defunded is traditionally a little different, but their average free trial to paid can be as high as like 30% less than 1 million. Things change though when you get to more than 1 million, but it's interesting because bootstrap founders, like, this is still such a huge opportunity for them. And this is why I fly many flags, but the activation flag is definitely one that I fly because it is something that I think could be improved across the board. And it's not for lack of trying. I think it's really, bootstrap founders just may not be aware of the process, which we're going to talk about today. But that I think is part of what's holding them back. And then I think the second thing that holds them back is just knowing the right things to do, like having the expertise of going through and like reshaping how they think about activation, which, that comes with working with experts, learning from experts, and also trial and error. But when it gets to 1 million, this is where we start to see like 20 and 25% defunded companies. If they're more than 1 million, they can be as high as like 30, 35, and 40%, which is pretty interesting. But what that tells me is that they typically have the resources to hire experienced talent. So that doesn't surprise me. My assumption here is that if they have the resources to hire skilled, experienced, quality talent, then they probably are investing in the right things, even if the CEO or founders are not like fully cognizant or aware of the process, if that makes any sense. Like maybe they have like a really dedicated head of growth or head of product or someone who's exceptional at product design or what have you. And that's part of what's helping create incredible activation rates. So I'll pause there because I definitely, one, I lost my train of thought, but also two, I'm curious if there are any questions.
No, I think, I guess a quick summary in my head so far is a lot of founders are checking the activation box because they added some tooltips or an onboarding checklist. And even if it's a small, they're leaving, even if it's a small percentage for, a low ARR company, they're leaving money on the table.
100%. Especially if they have very low activation rates, or I will say free trial to paid conversion rates. That is technically different than like a true activation rate. But yes, if you've got a low free trial to paid activation rate, activation is definitely something to look at, because if we are attracting the right ICP and they're not converting, then it's definitely a huge opportunity. The other way to think about this, though, is if you are not, the other way to think about this is, maybe you have like 20% conversion rate from free trial to paid, or maybe you've got even 30%. Something I think that a lot of founders also don't consider is that that's the floor. That's not the ceiling. I've seen products, no credit card required, convert like as high as like 60% and still have incredible retention at the end. Like it is possible to get even higher. And it's interesting though, because I think a lot of teams, they reach the benchmark and then they're kind of like, okay, we're done. But actually there are a lot of things that they could do to continue to improve it. And that type of investment is compounding. I think this is the other thing too, I think a lot of teams forget about is if you can improve that core metric by 5%, 10%, you will continue to experience that extra 10% delta months and months and months, assuming nothing crazy happens to your product and it decreases. So I think a lot of people kind of forget that a lot of this compounds, and the better that your marketing gets, the better that your acquisition gets, the better that your product gets, all of that speaks to each other. And this is where we see accelerating growth. And there is a reason why, back in the day, Patrick Campbell basically was like, hey, like your fastest lever for growth is not actually marketing. I know it feels that way. In the early days, it feels that way. But once you get to certain milestones, like you get to 1 million or you get to 2 million or 5 million, marketing is not going to be the only thing that helps you scale. It's actually going to be a lot of product. It's going to be activation, retention, monetization. Like those are going to be your big three. Acquisition will continue to be a driver, of course. You'll continue to expand your markets. You'll, potentially at least, but it's not going to be the like super exponential thing that you think it's going to be. Where exponential growth comes from is actually everywhere else. So anyway, so that's my little spiel about activation.
Got it. So should we dive into process?
Yeah, how we do it. Okay. So the Busy Founder's Guide to Activation. So the first step is probably going to surprise you, but it's absolutely necessary. And if you want to improve your activation, the first step, honestly, is seeing the product through someone else's eyes. And I'm not talking about screen replays or session like screen recording type stuff. Those tools are great. The problem with them is that they don't have context. You don't know if that person's qualified. You don't know what that person's trying to accomplish. And that person can't talk to you through the screen. They can't tell you when they're distracted. They can't tell you when they're confused by something. They can't tell you when they're frustrated or they're like, I'm lost. They can't tell you when they're excited, when they're like, oh, that's cool. I like that. Screen recordings are cool, but like, I don't put that much weight on them. I think you can glean certain things from them, but to me, I just feel like you're just making a lot of assumptions. I'm just like, you don't actually know. And that's why I don't waste a whole lot of time like on watching session replays. You just don't know. And until you do like good UX interviews, you're going to keep thinking that those session replays are telling you something. I'm sorry. Maybe that's me. I'm not going to say that they're a waste of time because they're not. I think that they do have a use case. They have value. I just think it's 10% of the value. 80% of the value is going to be in the UX interview. So the first thing you're going to do is identify a few audience members, people who are not customers. And this is really, really, really important. They can't be customers and they can't be people who've heard of your brand before. They've got to be strangers and ideally within your ICP. They don't have to be a perfect buyer. They can be what we call a proxy, which is someone who's close. They don't have to be perfectly qualified. And this is also really, really, really important because the thing about good product experiences is that they're universal. Great product experiences are universal. If your proxy gets it, your core audience is probably going to get it. So all that to say, it's crucial though that these are people who don't already use your product. The reason why is because customers who already use your product, they're survivors. We're going to talk about survivor bias, but customers are actually survivors of your product. Customers also give you the false sense of security that your product is great and amazing and it makes sense to everyone. And I guarantee you it doesn't. So all that to say, customers are survivors and we don't want to introduce survivorship bias or survivor bias because survivor bias is what makes us think that everything is okay. We need strangers, ideally qualified strangers. So there are products that we use for this. Userinterviews.com is one. They just got bought by user testing. So I'm curious to see like where the product goes from here. There's also respondent.io. And there are a couple of others out there, maybe a little bit more fringe. Or maybe we just haven't used them as much, but there are definitely others out there. But those are the top two that we use to find our ICP for our clients. And what's cool about UX interviews is that you don't need 20 of these. You just need like 3 to 5, ideally with, again, qualified folks. And you'll need a tiny bit of budget, not a lot. I would say max, you'll probably spend it's like $200 a person. So if you do 5, you'll spend about $1,000.
And does that include the incentive?
Yes. So it's like $100 for, a B2B person and then an extra $100 for the incentive. So yeah, it's like about $200 a pop. But If you do 5 of them, it's like $1,000. And the cool part is you're going to do this once and you're going to be like, oh, this was awesome. We should do it again. And what you're going to do is you are going to have them review the site as if they were considering it for themselves. Then you're going to give them a prompt. And the prompt should be closely tied to what your value aha moment is. So when you are in your product, what do you think is the most critical thing for people to do in that product? Now, I say think. You can use data to back this up. So if you wanted to be really thorough, you would use Amplitude or Mixpanel or whatever your product analytics is. Probably, like if you've been talking to customers, if you understand your customer really well, you would already have a sense for what those moments are. And maybe it's one critical thing, maybe it's like 2 or 3 things. What I find is more common is like it's like 2 or 3 things. They have to overcome this one thing first, and then they've got to use this particular feature or thing, and then by that point they've probably like achieved value. Understanding that value moment is crucial, and you can certainly, get high fidelity information on this, but intuitively speaking, you probably already know what it is. So you're going to have those users, these audience members that are not customers, you're going to have them try to go through the process of accomplishing those milestones to achieve the value moment. We just did this with a product, and their value moment was, it's actually like tracking time. It's a time tracking tool, platform, I should say. But in order to track time, they have to be able to add their employees. They have to then be able to configure the time tracking module, like to determine, well, how are the employees going to actually track time? And then they have to actually do the time tracking. Like the employees have to actually now time track. And it's really tough to get total strangers to go through like entire processes. But what we learned was just adding in the employees was really hard. Like that was already like a huge barrier to entry. And watching them struggle for their lives to do this was illuminating. And I will say, if you're a founder who is technical, like you also built the product, there's nothing more
Humbling.
Humbling is a word. Yeah. I was going to say like painful. There's nothing more painful than watching someone struggle for their lives in your product. But the goal here is to not help them or guide them through the process. Because, if you're interviewing someone and you're doing a UX interview, like they kind of want to use you as their crutch, to be honest, like as the interviewee as the interviewer, like they kind of they want you to like give them the answer. But no, like you have to let them struggle. And I 100% guarantee that they will. They're going to struggle. And you're going to do your best not to guide them until you absolutely, painfully have to. But the thing is that users, customers, audience members, they never think that the product is the problem. Sometimes you get lucky and you get someone who's brutally honest and is like, that was super confusing. I didn't understand that at all. But most of the time, I would say 80, 70% of the time, people will blame themselves. They'll be like, oh, I'm so dumb. I didn't understand that. Or I didn't get it. It's me. I'm the problem. This made sense. But actually, listener, they're not the problem. It was the UX. It was the UI. It was the design. So anytime you hear a customer, sorry, I should say user, because these are not customers. Anytime you hear like a user or an audience member be like, oh, that was me. No. It was not them. Don't take that as an answer, or like take that with a grain of salt, I should say. Don't listen to that response. Most people won't blame the product. They'll blame themselves. And that's why these interviews are so critical, because it gives you an insight into the mind of the survivor. So think about it this way too. The people who make it, like the people who become customers, they're surviving your experience. They basically did, like your product is American Ninja Warrior or whatever, and they made it. But think about all the people who beef it and don't make it. And it's because they get distracted, they get frustrated. But again, they're not thinking this product is trash. They're thinking, I'm not the right person for this. It's me. And then they leave. And then you never see them ever again. And they decide in that moment. And subconsciously, they may feel like it was the design, like it was the experience, or there was something confusing about it. But consciously, that's not what they're thinking. They're thinking like, oh, I'm the problem. This probably isn't for me if that's the case. So let me go somewhere else. And like, it's not you guys, it's me. It's like, so anyway, so you're going to hear that a lot. But what you pay attention to the most in these interviews is where they get stuck, where they struggle, where they get confused. And you're going to notice, ideally, like you're taking notes. You're making observations about, oh, they didn't see that button, or oh, they clicked that button, but it didn't do what they thought it was going to do. Or they're looking for something, and maybe you even ask, hey, what are you looking for? And like, I'm looking for a way to X. And you got to resist the urge to tell them what to do. And, UX interviews are hard because, like, especially if you built the product, because you you have to resist the desire to show them how to use it. If you can resist that desire, then you're going to learn a lot. If you can't, you shouldn't be running the interview. Someone else should. But all to say, you've got to watch them, again, struggle, and you've got to make observations and take notes. And what you're going to find is by the third interview, especially if it's a good one, by the third interview, well, first it's going to feel painful. But you are going to have a lot of information about, okay, here's what's broken, or here's where people are getting stuck. Here's where people are getting confused. The fourth and the fifth interviews are really kind of where you can play a little bit, and you can actually have people even skip certain things. And they won't know it any differently. You will, because you've been through the whole process. But usually like the fourth and fifth interview, we may have like different things that we want them to look at, because maybe we've seen enough of what we've seen, and now we're kind of like, okay, like let's get into iteration mode, or like let's like start thinking about like other objectives. But once you've got those 3 to 5 interviews, that's all you need. You don't need 100 of them. You just need 3 to 5. And again, not super expensive. From there, you are then going to sign up for your own product as on a normal person screen, not like your big space cadet giant screen. I know a lot of developers love, a lot of technical founders love. Use like a normal screen, like a 15-inch Mac, or like a 15-inch, 13-inch, 17-inch, and that's it. Because that's what normal people, regular people use. Maybe even your phone, if it's mostly mobile. And you are going to take a screenshot of every single screen, and then you're going to annotate. I like to put my screenshots in a Miro board, and then I'll make annotations, and I'll say, okay, this was confusing as heck. This is where people get stuck. This is where people get distracted. This makes sense. This doesn't make sense. And you start annotating it based on what you've identified. And then from here, so you have like your Miro board of screenshots and annotations and notes. Now from here, this to me is the fun part. It's all fun to me, honestly. But to me, the fun part is like dreaming up what the better experience is. And if you have design skills, or if you have a designer or a product leader on deck, you can start to hypothesize and ideate and design new ideas. So, okay, this is where people get stuck. There's either too much information here, or there's a lot going on, or like maybe they need to take a specific step, but it's really, really, really hard to take that step for whatever reason. Maybe it's confusing or it's not clear. And your mission is to do 3 things. You're either going to reduce cognitive overload, meaning when I look at this part of the product, or when I look at this screen or this step or this stage, am I overwhelmed? If I am, it's probably because there's just too much happening on the page, or it's not clear what I should do next. So you can have a lot on the page, but it needs to still be clear what the next step is. How can we reduce or alleviate cognitive overloads? That's the first. The second is uncertainty. Uncertainty is what happens when a new user, they're like, basically like have you ever had that experience where like you've gotten to a product and you were like, I don't know what to do next. What's next? Mm-hmm. Yeah, like it happens all the time. Uncertainty. And it can be the briefest of pauses. I've used a lot of software, so my pauses are not that long. But if you're imagining someone maybe not as tech savvy, or who doesn't live and breathe SaaS PLG all day, their pauses might be kind of long. They might be like they might just literally like just be sitting there like, I don't know what to do next. And maybe like they're moving their mouse around a lot. Like they're looking for what to do next. So we call that uncertainty. It's not that it's an overwhelming page. If anything, it's underwhelming. They're like, I don't know what's next. So we're relieving uncertainty. And the last thing is limited attention, meaning we don't have this person's attention for a very long time. Are we asking too much? We see limited attention the most in sign-up flow processes, where you're asking like a million questions, or there's a lot of steps. I just signed up for a product recently, and it had, no joke, like 10 steps. And there was a part of me that was like, these are a lot of damn steps. I think it was AirOps. Love AirOps. It's a really cool product. But I remember thinking like, there are so many steps in this process. Like, when is it going to be over? And they've got like a progress loading bar, but I still was just like, this is so long. But I understand why they did it, because you do kind of need, like, AirOps needs that data from you to make it good.
Right. They wanted to populate things for you. So
right.
You saw the value.
But I remember thinking like, damn, this is a lot of steps, but I'm highly motivated as an individual, so I dealt with it. But limited attention. So cognitive overload, uncertainty, and limited attention. Those are the top 3 things that happens in a product. And our mission is to make sure that we are relieving all of those at every touch point. If you're dealing with limited attention, you want to shorten the steps. If you're dealing with uncertainty, you want to look at the literal UX design of what it is that screen is. And you want to ask yourself, is it clear to me what the next step is? You might have 4 buttons on that page that are all the same color. and they're all competing with each other, and it's visually not clear. So your understanding of design is also going to be really important. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at products where they have like, they're using one color, maybe the product is white, but their secondary color is like blue, and everything is blue. And you look at it and you're like, I don't know what's the number one call to action on this page? Do I click this or do I click that? Like what? And it depends on the jobs to be done, obviously, of the product. But I cannot tell you how many times visually it's actually not clear what to do next on the page. So uncertainty comes up. And then finally, cognitive overload. There is too much happening on this page. It's not that people don't know what to do next. It's more like there are too many things to do next. And it's not clear to me what's actually going to help me accomplish what I want to accomplish. And we see this often too, where there's just a lot going on a page. And you're just like, and I say page, I consider in-app pages. I'm also thinking about like, what's the word? Sign up flow. All of these are part of the process. Same thing actually for becoming a customer. So payment. So there's cognitive overload for payment as well. And there are things that we can do to simplify experiences visually. Even just visually simplifying something can do wonders. There's also like, from like a product perspective, simplifying, just like the experience of the page itself, design aside. But that is the process. And ideally, like you have an incredible team of people that you're working with who can ideate this with you and who can, or maybe it's just you and you can kind of hopefully the interviews help you get out of your head a little bit and you can see it how they see it. And that's why we always do this as a process, because it's easy for like me and Kim, for example, to work on a product and see it differently than the founder but it's another thing to see it through the eyes of the person who might buy it. And that is why we do it. Because again, it's not about what makes sense to you. It's about what makes sense to them. And if it's not clear to them, like you're literally losing money. You're leaving money on the table. And they're not getting the value that they want. Because if they have the problem and they want to solve it, you're not making it easy for them to do that. And, for it to feel like a mutually beneficial relationship.
Right.
That.
So if you do the interviews, using Miro is great. Hopefully you have a designer or someone in product that can help you. You make changes. Now what? Should you now immediately go and do another 3 to 5 interviews?
So what I recommend is, activation is hopefully an ongoing process, but some people do treat it more like a sprint. So hopefully you have like new ideas, updated comps, working comps, whatever, and you can implement that pretty quickly. Obviously there are big changes that you can make. Maybe those take more time. Ideally, you go for big swings. So I don't recommend that teams, because it's not that I don't like these as tools. They are helpful tools. I don't recommend teams waste a whole lot of time on like, pop-ups and checklists and walkthroughs. I recommend teams take a cold, hard look at product and like look at every screen and make the changes there, because your biggest, best swings on activation are going to come from that. It's not necessarily going to always come from, like the tooltips and the pop-ups and blah, blah, blah. Are they helpful? Yes. But I am a firm believer that they are only helpful on top of an existing great design. That's my belief. But anyway, So, and also just from what I've seen. So yeah, implement the changes. And then, Kim, to your point, yeah, I do recommend doing another round. And, depending on how quick or fast the changes were, there are some projects where, the team makes changes like in a couple of weeks and it's awesome. And we're like, oh, cool. And doing a second batch. So do a second batch of 5, ideally not the same batch, ideally a different batch, going through the same process, and give them the same prompts or slightly adjusted prompts depending on, how much you've changed, but see how people navigate. And again, we just went through this where we did our first 5, took away some very clear design changes and UX changes to make. The team implemented them very quickly. And then we did another 5 and new things popped up. Nothing necessarily with what we had implemented. It was actually more like we had made so much progress in removing the barrier for one of the steps that people were now like exploring other parts of the product that we were like, oh, we didn't expect you to look at that, because people usually end up stuck on the first thing. So then we were like, okay, crap, we got to like go back to we got to like go and fix these screens now and like adjust this, and all very positive. And, activation is iterative. It's not meant to be, okay, we've done it once and now it's done forever. No, it's meant to be, let's continue thinking about how to improve these experiences. And we did it for that batch, and that was a relatively homogenous batch, meaning it was mostly a heterogeneous batch, meaning like it was many different types of buyers. You could do a homogenous batch where like, let's say you're targeting many different industries or different personas. Heterogeneous batch would be like, you're kind of picking people from all of those, and it's okay if it's a mix. A homogenous batch would be like, maybe you target nail salons and maybe you target massage spas or whatever. Homogenous would be like all nail salons and see how they do it. Then you can get into like more homogenous studies where, okay, we want to just look at this persona type or maybe just this vertical and see like how did they use it and how is that different than maybe like other types of buyers. And you'll get even more insight. And then you'll start to kind of play the game a little bit of like, okay, do we depend on like, do we make an adjustment here? And is that a universal adjustment? Do we personalize certain experiences? Do we maybe adjust messaging on some of these pages to make sure it makes sense for everyone? There's so much that you can get into, as you continue the activation process. And then, and only then, after you've done this hard work, because this is hard work. It's not, it's not like overnight, although it can be depending on how fast you move. I do think that a lot of that is a choice. Like you can choose to be slow or you can choose to be fast, no tea, no shade. But I also think that after doing all of that, then you can look at tooltips and pop-ups and walkthroughs. Because again, I guess I am kind of biased against them. I think that they are helpful. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that they're not helpful, and I'm not saying don't use them. What I am saying is don't let them be a crutch for poor experiences, especially when the average like pop-up blindness now for people is just so sky high. Like you're really gambling with, you're gambling with your life a little bit if you're depending on those to explain to people what your product does. Or you could just roll up your sleeves and actually address your UX design and product issues. And I think like that's the ultimate goal. That's the onboarding sign-up flow process. And that's for new users. The other side to this story is for people who become a customer early and now you got to keep them. So for example, maybe your trial is 14 days. And the whole goal is to get them to the moment of value within that 14 days, ideally as fast as humanly possible. On average, you've got like less than 10 minutes with the average new PLG sign-up, if you think about it. If you have good new user retention, you'll probably see them again. You might have a high chance of seeing them again in the next 24 hours, but most products don't. Most products don't have great new user retention. So like 70% of people will drop off after the first 24 hours and never come back. So you really don't have that much time actually with a person in your product. So if your experience is not incredible, again, you're just leaving money on the table. All but to say though, there are some people who become customers very quickly. Maybe they convert within like 48 hours. Sometimes they convert like well within the 14 days. And some people don't convert within 14 days, but they're like, I need an extension. Yeah, maybe they're not as active. They didn't have the time, or there was something blocking them from making progress. And they're like, okay, I just need like an extra week. You give them the extension, whatever. Now it's 21 days. So the other side to activation is once they get to the value moment, the rest of their jobs to be done have to be also easy and seamless. Like it's not enough to have an incredible onboarding experience. The rest of the product also has to be pretty dang easy to use. And this is where we get into retention. And this is why activation speaks to retention pretty heavily. Because if you have great activation, in theory, you are creating better circumstances for better retention. However, you can have great activation and not have good retention. And the reason why is usually because the jobs to be done that the product is helping people with or trying to help people with maybe isn't that good at helping people with it. So this process that I just described, you can actually also apply the same process to like later stage activation, which is what we call it. When I was on the board of Moz, we had what was called like qualified churn versus unqualified churn. And unqualified churn were people who didn't fit the ICP, who churned within a set period of time, even if they became a customer. The trial, I think, was, I can't remember exactly how long the trial was. It was either like 20 or 30 days, maybe less. But I'll never forget us discussing as a board, like qualified versus unqualified churn. And the concept that just because someone becomes a customer within the trial, they can still suffer the same types of churn and potentially even worse because maybe they didn't activate properly. So I'll just say, so just because someone becomes a customer doesn't automatically mean now it's churn and retention's problem. It might still be part of activation. So all that to say, and again, this is kind of where it does blur a little bit, but really we don't think about retention. It doesn't really truly like kick in until 6+ months after. Activation still includes the process of, okay, they became a customer, but now they have to live with the product for a little bit. And that process of living with the product, that is where you might want to consider UX interviews with customers, especially relatively new customers. So you can go through the same exact process that I just described. I talked about it from the lens of talking to people who've never heard of your business before, or heard of your product and never used it before. You can rinse, wash, and repeat that with existing customers. You wouldn't have to source them, obviously, through user interviews because they're your customers, but observe them using the product, observe them accomplishing tasks. I like to use jobs to be done as a way to think about this and as a way to kind of structure our thinking process behind what are the different things that people will do. Because, like, let's be honest, like, it doesn't really matter how your product is structured. What matters is what is the progress that people are trying to make and how does your product enable people to do that. So who cares about screens when, like, they want to do something? How does your product help them do that? And then watch them do it. And you'll again, just like with the UX interviews for activation and sign up, you're going to see the same types of things pop up for when people are lost or confused. I like to use newer customers for this because they're not usually as familiar with the product. You could certainly use audience members for this, but the tricky part will be if you can provision them an account that already kind of like has stuff in there. So this is where like having like demo data or sandbox environments, and you give people logins and you have them navigate, and you kind of, you might have to like guide them a little bit. You could give them the prompt, depending on where that prompt starts, if you wanted like rawer data, but I think customers are really helpful for this as well. So
right, because you want those audience members too to be familiar probably with similar tools or have used similar competing tools, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But customers are still help. And ideally like they're a little bit newer customers, but it's still helpful to watch people who are more familiar with the brand and the product to use it. Because again, if they're living with it, they can tell you and show you, here's what works and here's what doesn't work. And here's what's confusing. But again, there's nothing quite like seeing it through their eyes. And I think that's the thing that I wish we did more of. And it doesn't have to be slow. It can be very fast. Again, I think speed is a choice. I really do. I think if it's important, if it's a core or key project or core, like if it's an objective for the quarter or what have you, this work can be very, very efficient if you really want to push it for it to be. And then the changes that you make. I mean, yeah, sure. Like you're going to implement stuff that maybe doesn't work, or maybe doesn't work the way that you think it does, or maybe it doesn't land in the way you think it will. But I'm going to wager that most of the stuff that you improve, it's going to actually work. It's going to help. And you're going to be blown away because you're going to be like, oh my gosh, look at all the ways that people are using the product that I had not considered. And then you'll start to solution for those things. But this is my thesis on how to approach activation. I don't think it comes from watching session replays all day. It really comes from understanding who the person is behind the screen and then actually watching them do it and having them talk through their thoughts, their ideas, what's confusing, what's not confusing, what works, what doesn't work, what are they looking for? Are they stuck? How are they feeling right now? Like those are all of the things that you just don't get by watching a session replay. Again, not knocking session replays either, but I'm just saying if that's the only way that you're doing activation, you're missing out on a whole other world of understanding for those buyers. And also specifically that it's your buyer type. That's the other part that matters too, because you navigating the product is different than me navigating the product, which is also different than your actual target buyer navigating the product.
Yeah. So what's so great about user interviews, responded.io, other ones that we don't know about. I don't know if people realize how detailed you can get, like how easy it is to, and of course you have to be smart about formulating a screener survey, and you want to make sure you're not leading people to answering how you want them to answer and all of that. But you can actually ask enough questions to make sure that people are in the right context. They have similar pain points and talk to those people. And I think it's easier than you might think.
I think in our last episode, we were talking about how like we can do UX interviews now in like less than 24 hours.
Right. We can qualified people.
We can find qualified people in like 24 to 48 hours. And the only times where we've not been able to do that have been extremely fringe audiences. Like there was one where a company approached us. They wanted to talk to like basically like billionaires, like people who have at least 10 million in liquid assets in the United States. And I was like, I don't know if those people care about doing research. Yeah, like, but that's a really tough audience to get.
That was a tough audience, but surprisingly, we've been able to talk to executives, CEOs, that group we can get. And then of course, any industry you could think of.
Literally any industry. I would say when it comes to B2B, they're absolutely reachable. There's B2C as well. Although I will say, B2C it just depends on how easy to reach they are. But most audiences are reachable. I think the one out of the hundreds that we've worked with, actually, there was one other audience, and we probably could have sourced this audience manually, actually. But those platforms didn't have like, do you remember that one project that we did where it was like founders? It was like technical founders who coded a very specific language, and it was a very niche. It was extremely niche. Probably not on userinterviews.com. However, we probably could have like found them through like a LinkedIn or whatever, and then like did it that way. So, but 90% of everyone who's listening right now is going to find their audience on those platforms, 100%. And fast, like within literally 24, 48 hours, you could be running interviews like right now. And then if you already have customers, I mean, yes, like they won't be as helpful from like the sign up flow process because they're used to your product already and they kind of already know, but they'll be helpful on the back end of things. So like once they have used it a little bit, where do they get stuck? How do they accomplish their goals? And that's also extremely valuable. But that's the process. And our typical project for something like this, if it's fast, it's 6 weeks. If it's a little slower, maybe it's a couple of months. So maybe like 8, sometimes 10 weeks. But the insight and the progress you make is like it's incredible. Speaking for ourselves a little bit, but what we have also heard from clients is they're like, oh my gosh, this is the most progress we've made in months on something like this. But also when there's a good process behind it, it does make it a little bit easier. Anyway, that's the guide. Did we miss anything? Did we cover?
I think the only thing I thought of as you were talking was you had mentioned the marketing site being a part of activation. And typically, and correct me if I'm wrong, Asia, we will start these interviews with people on the marketing site or starting from the homepage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And you're kind of guiding them or letting them guide you into signing up or a free trial or whatnot.
Yeah, 100%. So the very first prompt is, I want you, like we'll have them share their screen. We'll give them the website, like the URL, and we'll be like, I want you to imagine that you are evaluating this for your own business. What are some of the things that you would go or like click on? And we make sure to give them full prerogative to actually do it. Because a lot of interviewees will sometimes be like, oh, they want me to just say what I would do. And I'm like, no, we want you to actually like do it. Like pretend we're not here. Just, navigate the site. What would you do?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this might be either a blog post or like a LinkedIn post that I'm going to do soon. The amount of people who don't click into pages and just use the menu to navigate is wild to me. So basically, like the menu of your site is actually an incredibly powerful tool that people will use. And sometimes they won't even click into stuff. They'll just like sign up immediately. Like they won't like click into deeper pages, but they'll go into your menu just to see if it's there. And it's how they educate themselves. It's fascinating. It's not something I had ever considered before, but we've seen that so many times now in the past few projects we've done. It's extremely common. So anyway, it's just a little tangent, but yes. And then we'll give them additional prompts to like sign up. How would they actually configure this like for their business? And yeah, that's where not all of the pain, but there's a little bit of pain that usually happens at that point. And then you're just like, God, and don't get me wrong, they're fun and they are also painful to watch. It's not painful for us to watch because we didn't build it, but for anyone who's watching from the team, usually it's a little painful for them to watch. They're like, kill me now. Why are they struggling? And it's like, well, that's the process. That's the point. And then you immediately want to fix it. And I tell founders this too, like, you're going to want to drop everything and you're going to want to fix everything. And to that I say, please, but also, don't break your neck. Like it's okay if we take our time. But yeah, it's still a fun process. I love it so much. It's one of my favorite projects that we do actually.
Yeah, it's good.
Cool. Alrighty. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks everyone.
And thank you, Kim, for joining me on this one. Yeah, I'm curious, like if anyone has any questions or if anything comes up I'm an open book. We're an open book. Happy to share, other like tips, tricks, things to think about. And if there's anything confusing, also happy to elaborate as well. But thanks again.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks everyone. Bye, Asia.